This program is brought to you by Globus.
System, power, and of course, multipolarity at a junction similarly with no compatibility, resulting to harsh public and foreign policy dynamics. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this other edition of your discursive program as we continue to zoom into the Ukraine crisis. And our focus this day is on the role of the European Union and NATO, of course, asking this very hard question if their involvement will actually lead to some sort of an escalation that can lead to a third world war with the Russian Federation actually being the preamble, or can be avoidable with the latest escalations, ladies and gentlemen, from largely failed sanctions to a now more systematic backing of Kiev-led strikes inside the Russian Federation. The global elites continue to mark their course in the proxy Ukraine war. EU NATO's political backing, arms transfers, and sanctions, among others, against Russia intensified, especially since after the start of the special military operation in 2022 February, and have turned Ukraine into somehow a battleground, according to some pundits. Kyiv strikes, drone and missile exchanges, and alleged provocations raise the risk of direct confrontation. So we ask a question among others, ladies and gentlemen: can Europe sustain Ukraine's defense without triggering full-scale escalation with the Russian Federation, or are current policies steering the country toward a wider war? This we're going to unravel with our panel Thursday, ladies and gentlemen, as we continue to look at the Ukraine crisis and, of course, its involvement and the recent escalation, prompting whole lot of opinions and analysis or interpretation of how the consequences can be and to what extent it can be sustained, preventing further escalation beyond the sphere of influence. And of course, I will join you right after the jingle, so as to introduce to you the panel of experts that will give us greater insights on our topic for discussion this day. You're welcome. Welcome back. Time for us to unravel the panel. And of course, I will start by introducing to you Yulia Burke. She's a political scientist and founder of Globus Expert Club. It's a pleasure having you again on this platform, dear Yulia.
To join you today. Good afternoon.
Thank you, and of course, for giving importance to this very timely discussion focusing on the role of the European Union and NATO countries, the alliance in ensuring, of course, asking the question if full escalation with Russia can be avoided. We go to the United States of America. Let's welcome Caleb Muffin, author, journalist, and political analyst. It's a pleasure having you this day.
Sure. Glad to be here.
Always a pleasure. And let's acknowledge Terry Laurent Palette, serial entrepreneur, geopolitical analyst. It's always a pleasure having you on this knowledge sharing platform, dear Terry.
Thank you very much for inviting me again, Clarice. Complete, in fact, your introduction. I need to say that I've been living 10 years in the United States, but also 10 years in Ukraine. And actually, I've been witnessing, in fact, the coup of Maidan that is putting me in the position of a witness, but also one of the best analyzer in Europe.
Thank you so much. We appreciate your importance to this very important platform. And for the first time on our knowledge sharing program, let's welcome Dr. Dieter. He's an historian and journalist from Austria, joining us from Vienna. It's a pleasure having you this day, sir.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you and hello from Vienna.
Thank you so much for honoring our invitation. Without much ado, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Achille Eke will be joining us subsequently. It is imperative for us to go with the conceptual analysis or interpretation. Of course, I've just been informed that Dr. Achille has joined the panel already, and his capacity as banker and, of course, CEO, Washington Valuation Group. He's joining us from the United States of America. Always a pleasure, sir.
Thank you, Clarice. Thank you for the invitation. I appreciate it. Sorry to be late.
Absolutely. Looking at the Ukraine crisis and, of course, the colossal effect, and, of course, how can Third World War be avoided? But do you think with the recent escalation, intentional escalation, according to what some pundits say, can this avoid a full escalation? Of course, this is what our guests or panel of experts will be answering in the course of this discussion. Without so much ado, we ride off with you, dear Yulia. It is imperative to note that yesterday, the 12th of June 2026, Russia commemorated Russia Day, and of course, in the heart of Ukraine crisis, it also saw Vladimir Putin, the president of the Russian Federation, meeting with stakeholders, of course, present at the front line of the special military operation. And of course, our question this day is if with the recent escalation that actually tortured civilians at this juncture and also occurring inside Russia, Moscow, and St. Petersburg, among others, can war or full escalation be avoided? Why we get your, holistic analysis of this topic?
Yes, thank you for the question. That really is a good one. And I think that's exactly what has been occupying the minds of most of the Russians, and not just Russians, but people all over Europe and maybe all over the world since 2014, actually, because at that point when the so-called anti-terroristic operation was launched against the civilians living in the region of Donbass, the talks about a possible escalation were also ongoing, and a lot of people have been saying that Russia could have started a counter operation in order to protect those civilians back then. Yet, unfortunately, all of the attempts to make a peace deal, all of the attempts to have mediators involved in order to guarantee the agreement signed and the Minsk Accords and all of those efforts, unfortunately, have not led to de-escalation. And moreover, we could see how starting from not even 2014, but even earlier, NATO has been quite active in Ukraine, training the Ukrainian army, supplying equipment, training the personnel in order for them to be able to use that equipment. And unfortunately, the escalation could not have been avoided. So when the critical point came in 2022, when it became clear that Zelensky was not planning to follow even the spirit of the Minsk Accords, not to mention the specific steps that were mentioned there, it was clear that a bigger escalation was unavoidable. And back in 2022, a lot of people were also thinking that it wouldn't take too much time. Yet what it came to, and what has been happening for quite a while by now, is an exhaustion war, meaning that the front line is not really moving too fast. Yet at the same time, both parties of the conflict, both sides, are exhausting their resources, starting from human resources and all the way down to military equipment and everything else. So this question has been on the agenda for over than a decade by now, and there is still no clear answer in terms of how the conflict can be settled. And we all remember President Trump boasting in his presidential campaign that he could settle that conflict within 24 hours somehow. Despite of that, a meeting took place between President Putin and President Trump, and the vague so-called spirit of anchorage is still unclear in its definitions. So, well, from the Russian point of view, the president of the Russian Federation has been saying, starting from 2022, that he's more than open to a peace settlement, to a peace deal. Yet at the same time, the crucial point in the Russian position is that its interests are to be taken into consideration, and it has to be not a short-term agreement, but it has to be a strategic deal, a strategic agreement that could, on the one hand, be guaranteed and be followed, unlike the Minsk Accords, and on the other hand, that this deal could actually consider Russia's interests as well.
A junction that is very complex at this moment. All parties talk peace, but then how can this peace be attained? Taking us down a memory lane, of course, we have seen the argument that the main agreement was just to give time to Ukraine to prepare actually militarily and otherwise. And then we are coming to understand, ladies and gentlemen, and asking this question, directing to you, Caleb Mothin, when we're talking about the EU and then the NATO involvement in the Ukraine crisis and the risks, we begin to think about political settlement or political or historical antagonism. And giving a contextual analysis with our topic, can we really say there is some sort of a true political agreement to such geopolitical programs, if we want to look at the historical relationship between the EU countries and of course the Russian Federation, former Soviet Union, in line with the ongoing 21st century proxy war?
Well, there is a lot of speculation that Donald Trump may be trying to end the conflict in Ukraine soon, simply for the fact that right now the global economy is screaming due to a lack of oil, and the Strait of Hormuz being closed, the Red Sea and Bab al-Mandab, that being closed down potentially by the Houthis, and the attacks on Iran have created a global situation in the energy markets that is, just destroying the American economy. And people are very, very angry at Donald Trump in the United States. His approval ratings are very, very low. And that if sanctions were to be lifted on Russia as a result of the conflict in Ukraine being brought to an end, that would result in Russian oil flooding onto the American and international markets, and that would have some relief in the energy markets. Now, Anna Paula Luna, who is the congresswoman from Florida, who has been negotiating with Kirill Dmitriev, the head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund, she spilled the beans recently and said that there is a deal to end the Ukraine conflict that Russia has agreed to, that America has agreed to. They're just waiting on Ukraine, and Ukraine is reliant on Britain and EU countries, and Ukraine is holding it up. But at this point, Washington and Moscow are ready to end the conflict, and there is an agreeable proposal on the table. Now, a lot of questions still remain, but the most hopeful thing is that at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, we saw Kirill Dmitriev sign an agreement with an engineering firm to establish and start building a tunnel connecting Alaska, the U.S. state of Alaska, to Russia over the Bering Sea. And that is an important step forward. And the understanding that we've gotten from the remarks of Kirill Dmitriev when he spoke in Washington and in New York City, and that's, when I had the opportunity to hear him speak in New York City, one of the things that he raised is that there is potential for this peace tunnel or peace bridge connecting the United States to the Russian Far East to be constructed. That would be an important step because not only would it connect the United States with Russia more? It would pivot the United States westward, and the U.S. economy would pivot closer to the rising economy in the East and further away from the EU countries, which are, representative of this decaying colonial international order, and that the United States, the only future it's going to have is going to be with the new economy. It needs to get further and further away from the dying Western financial system. And it seems like that is a division among our elite. Donald Trump has made noise about the possibility of annexing Canada, or at least Western Canada. What that's about is that, that Alaska, the U.S. state of Alaska, that's not connected to the rest of the continental United States, between Alaska and the continental United States is Western Canada. And if we were to engage in economic development, pivot closer to Russia, Western Canada is a big gap, connecting. But yet the people in Western Canada tend to be more conservative, tend to be Trump supporters. And we saw the trucker convoys that happened a few years back where there were big protests in that region. And in that region of Canada, unlike Eastern Canada, in that region of Canada, they tend to be quite conservative and they tend to be more sympathetic to Donald Trump and to the United States. It's in Ontario and other places in Canada that you have kind of anti-US and pro-European sentiment. So there are big divisions among the elite, and that creates an opportunity for those of us who want the rising new economy to expand and grow and allow influence and trade around the world. That creates an opportunity. Now, right now, Donald Trump and his administration are just completely, devastating the world economy, and their position in the world is sinking due to this war in Iran. Their isolation from the international community is increasing. But then that raises the question, will they seize this opportunity and actually end the conflict? We have to see. I mean, as of now, there's no real indication of what the Trump administration may be willing to do. But the fact that, the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum that just took place in Russia, U.S. media made a big deal out of the fact that Candace Owens, a conservative podcaster who is anti-Israel, that she attended it. And that was the focus of American media. But there was a large delegation of, people from the White House, people in the Trump camp that attended the forum. And that's gotten very little attention in American media, but it is a reality. And that points to the possibility that it could mean that in light of the situation, the White House does want to move ahead and make a peace deal in Ukraine. However, at the end of the day, if Zelensky and the Ukrainian regime, which is full of fanatical extremists, if they were to, make a peace deal, they would have to ultimately agree to it, and they're accountable not just to the United States, but also to Britain and also to the European Union countries. Ukraine's not a sovereign country, let's be clear. Ukraine lost its sovereignty in 2014 when its elected government of Yanukovych was toppled. There are fanatical extremist groups that have been cultivated by the West that have a lot of influence. And at the end of the day, Zelensky is just a vassal. He's just a puppet. And the Ukrainian state that was created post 2014 is just a mechanism for attacking and antagonizing Russia. And it is a murderous regime. I mean, we saw the horrendous attack on a children's school that was carried out recently. We've seen, the way these drones are shot into
Okay.
civilian areas. So, yes.
Thank you so much. Of course, we are going to enter in total into all those stakes as far as we are looking at the following event of the crisis. Let me come now to you, Terry. Of course, from the geopolitical perspective, we want to have your holistic interpretation of EU NATO's involvement, especially its new foreign policy. According to reports and of course pundit or expert analysis, the sanctions tactics seems not to have yielded the anticipated results. But then there is a new tactic of probably having attacks leading to more provocation. So let's try to analyze this foreign policy push of the EU in the Ukraine crisis and how this is actually changing the course of the war, especially in line with strategic decisions to be taken by the Russian Federation and anyone else or other stakeholders.
First of all, I would like to wish Yulia Седьем Россия, because it was the anniversary of the creation of Russia, and last week I was invited by the ambassador in Paris, in fact, for this event. So I would like to quote the Vice Chancellor Busiek, that our dear friend Dieter knows very well. And he used to say, when the business is gone, the tanks are coming. And I have been witnessing, in fact, the buildup of the Ukrainian crisis, because I had, in fact, to witness the coup of Maidan due to the fact that I was living about 50 meters from the spot. And during this year of 2014-2015, I have been witnessing a level of violence in Ukraine that was absolutely ugly, to the point that I had, in fact, to understand what was going on. Remember one thing, what Kissinger was saying in the 70s. He was saying, Ukraine is the red line. We cannot touch this country. The CIA in the 70s was saying exactly the same thing. They were understanding that there could be a parallel between Mexico and Ukraine. And we could not even imagine that Russia will be proposing partnership, in fact, to install nuclear weapons in Mexico. And when this crisis has been developing, I wanted absolutely to understand what was going on. And I wanted, in fact, to warn most of the politicians in France, and this is what I did. I was calling the parliament, I was calling the senators, I was calling VIPs within the Economic Forum, and I was warning them, telling them that if the country was just like switching into a level of violence above what I have been witnessing, this would cause a huge amount of problem for Europe. But I was very, very naive, because at that moment, I did not understood that that was something that was wanted. And I am going to reveal you a conversation that I had with Pierre Persson, who was very close to Emmanuel Macron at this point, at this moment, because he became, after that, he's a director of campaign. This guy was a deputy, socialist deputy. And when I have been referring to whatever I have been seeing in Kiev, the first thing that he told me is that, don't worry about that. We are very much aware of it, and don't put your nose in the story. At that moment, I have been understanding that something was very, very wrong. And to explain, in fact, how the buildup has been happening within this crisis, we need, in fact, to observe the GDP of Ukraine after the coup of Maidan. It has been dropping by 50%. And actually, during the COVID crisis, the only country that has been having its GDP doubling is Ukraine. How this is possible? Because the economy of Ukraine is not fantastic, and it went from $100 billion to $200 billion. What does it mean? It means that, in fact, there was a capital, massive capital, that was flowing inside of Ukraine. So basically, with this capital that has been flowing, after the Minsk Agreement number 2, stipulating, in fact, the independence, the management independence of the two territories of Donetsk and Lugansk. In fact, the Ukrainians, they have been building a lines of defense absolutely colossal, injecting massive amount of money to build, in fact, those infrastructure. So basically, what we can understand is that there was a strong will to attack the Donbass at a point in time. And I haven't been understanding why Russia was not interfering within, in fact, the Donbass to stop, in fact, the provocation that has been developed for years from 2015 to 2022. But in fact, I understood exactly what has been happening is that if sanctions were applied on an economical point of view to Russia, they wouldn't have been able, in fact, to resist and to face up the amount of sanctions that could have been hitting Russia. Example, cutting off, in fact, the switch. So basically, I have been attending to a certain numbers of meetings, and I have been witnessing the fact that Russia was structuring its financial approach to the conflict by setting up numbers of partnership, and especially with China, by suggesting, in fact, to build the Belt and Road Initiative, because this project is coming from Vladimir Putin. It's not coming from Xi Jinping. It has been suggested to Xi Jinping, in fact, to build it in the way that China would be able, in fact, to supply Russia.
Okay.
Let me finish because it's very important.
All right, just round up, please.
As soon as that was done, the Ukrainians in middle of February, they were ready, in fact, to attack. And this is what they did, because the provocation has been starting on the 17th of February. And Russia was, the President Putin was under pressure because he had, in fact, to face the demand of the Duma to recognize the two republics of Donetsk and Lugansk. So basically, when the Ukrainians, they have been attacking on the 17th of February, Vladimir Putin has been recognizing this republic. And this is how the story has been starting since 2022.
Absolutely, it is always imperative to go back to revisit history, understanding the cause of it to in our contemporary society. Dr. Data, with you, as a historian, we want to look at how some of the historical grievances have actually affected the course of the Ukraine war. Do you think, in your own perspective, that if these historical grievances were kept aside, we would have been talking about a post-Ukraine crisis, looking at all the the first and the second Minsk agreement, and of course all the other peace initiatives that have been taken to ensure a very constructive settlement to the proxy war.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for this question. I think the crucial question is all these peace initiatives that we have seen so far. That I mean, it has mentioned before that there is a willingness, I think, from the US side to find a conclusion to this war, but the willingness is not here on the side of Kiev and not on the side of the EU. I think a crucial and a crucial destructive role in this whole situation plays the European Union and the European Union. Not only with their military and financial support that we are seeing towards the regime in Kiev, but also their role within all international organizations. And when I look at the situation, I mean, the question of this program is if a full-scale a full escalation with Russia is still avoidable. If I'm looking at the situation, particular here in Vienna, where we have the headquarters of dozens of international organizations like OSCE, one of the UN headquarters, we already see a full escalation with Russia on different levels, but not on a military level yet. We see a full we see confrontation, escalation on diplomatic, economic, political levels with Russia that goes far beyond the question of Ukraine. The sanctions policy of the European Union, and particularly how the international organizations have been basically being paralyzed by the whole situation. Only the last couple of days, the situation at the International Atomic Energy Agency here in Vienna, which held its June Board of Governors meeting, where you saw once again that this international organization is basically paralyzed because it's split into two blocks: the Western bloc by the US and the European states and their allies, and then the bloc surrounding Russia, China, Iran, and their allies. The same we see in the OSCE, where there is enormous pressure to basically eventually get rid of Russia, which is contrary to the founding ideals of this organization. So I think there is no, although, and as the previous speaker said, there is signs regarding a return to some kind of a normalization between the US and Russia. We cannot see that between the European, the EU states and Russia. And as the situation is now, I think there is no return back there. So I think we are already in the middle of a full escalation, but not a military one. The escalation is played out on various levels at the moment. And as the situation is now, and we see that there is little military and financial support coming from the US side, or less than before, to Kiev, and the EU alone cannot sustain it. I don't think that we will see a military escalation in Ukraine, but we will see the escalation between NATO and Russia in other parts of what they call the NATO eastern flank, particularly in the Balkans, where Germany is more and more getting into a more aggressive role against Russia, and this situation is very dangerous. Germany, with the rebuilding and rearmament policy, is on the march to escalating to starting a war. Germany says it. With 2030, they want to have the strongest army in Europe. They want to be prepared for a war in Russia. Germany is preparing for a war against Russia, and this is a very, very dangerous situation. Friedrich Merz is playing with fire here, and I think there is, unfortunately, you cannot revise this path of history anymore, the way the European Union, particularly Germany, pushed it into one direction.
Absolutely, and this is where the problematic lies. And can this be avoidable, or the Ukraine crisis is just some sort of a proxy battlefield into waging war against Russia? And if thus be the case, what will be the overall consequences, not just regarding nations in Europe, Russia, but then we look at how this is going to affect the global system, especially in a multipolar setting. In the same perspective, we're rounding with the first phase of it, interpretation. With all the stakes already highlighted, Dr. Ashil Eki, we want to elaborate the key, especially economic turning points in line with recent escalations of targeting oil tankers, Russian oil tankers, and how this is somehow affecting the economic dynamics of, countries having to rely on Russia for oil and energy products?
Is that to me?
Sure, Dr. Ashio Eki.
Okay, sorry. Yes, because it was cutting off there, so I couldn't really understand the question. Um, well, the impact of oil on the world, is that the question? Because I didn't really
Actually, we're
understand. Can you
looking at
repeat the
the
question? Yes.
turning point of the crisis lately with the escalations targeting oil tankers, and how we
Wow.
looking at the economic ramifications of such attacks, and if this alone cannot lead to some sort of a change of tactics or strategy on the Russian side, that can lead us to full, probably lead the world to full escalation, and how this is going, the economic impact of this, not just to the parties at war, but then countries relying on the Russian Federation for oil and other energy products.
Right. I mean, we already have, included the impact of that war in the economy already. It's been this war's been going on since 2022, and it's we are. I think there's a feeling of that Ukraine war is fatigue already that is settling, quietly in people's minds because, Donald Trump came in with the desire to stop this war within 24 hours, even before he takes, his swearing ceremony. And we are over a year now since he took over, and so nothing have changed. So this is becoming, with the situation with Iran today. Ukraine war has been a little bit, on the back of the burner. I have personally, I don't focus anymore on that war anymore because it feels like the U.S. is trying to get away from that war to get out of the quagmire it is in with Iran, and so they're trying to let the European and Ukraine deal with that situation. And so, in doing so, it's taking away the headlines of what is happening in that region, and you know, periodically we can hear different issues about attacks from Ukraine into Russia, and everything that is happening in Europe. Some bellicose language that's been developed by many leaders there. Especially the Germans. It feels like they really are. The chancellor there, is really hyped into, trying to hype this war into, going into expanding that war, with direct conflict with Russia. So on the economic front, we see that the economies of these areas have been hit very hard. Europe's economy is where we know it's not growing much. It's looking for oil everywhere it can find. It doesn't want to go back to the Russian oil, which is the cheapest and easiest way for them to be able to get, fuel, get oil. But at the same time, the public opinion is fatigued, and people want to go back to normal life, and that's the conflict that they're in. The leaders want to go back to war, want to escalate this war, but the people don't want to do that. And and so it's a situation where in the meantime they're attacking, Russia tanks, or Russian economy, as more sanctions, and it's just on and on. So there is a fatigue, and we see that in both Russia and Ukraine and Europe. And so we really don't know where this is going to end. I hear that Mr. Trump has a desire to stop this war as quickly as possible, to go to focus only on on the Iranian war, and then deal with the Eastern countries, the Eastern powers, notably China. But until that war is solved, it's gonna be difficult for the economy of all the superpowers in the world, all the powers in the world, including the BRICS countries, to really breathe, because there is a lot of issues with oil, with energy, and we know energy it's what is the fuel of the economy. There's no energy, there's no economy. So therefore, it's important that we get back to normalization, we stop all these wars, and then in the people, their normal lives. Otherwise, we don't know where we're going, and we're just turning in circles.
Yeah, that is why we started this program by highlighting like systems and of course power at a crossroad with multipolarity but without compatibility. Then what can be done to take the world, towards a more concerted and perfect trajectory for global cooperation and interaction. Coming back to you, dear Yulia, this time around, we want to look at recently Zelensky sent out a message, and then from the analysis and the context of the message, we want to bring us to some sort of an aspect of corporate governance where we see whitewashing by corporations actually presenting themselves as being at the right spot in terms of meeting the expectations of institutions. Can we actually relate that, especially with the position of the Kyiv regime, sending out a letter calling for peace? Of course, looking at the European Union, we saw the visit by the E3 to the Russian Federation calling for peace, yet not neutral on their stance, and it brings us to understanding some sort of to an extent how public relations affect the course of such geopolitical wars or confrontations in the contemporary society.
Well, talking about the letter that was sent to President Putin during the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, what made it to the headlines of the news all across the globe was that Zelensky came up with some kind of a peace initiative and called for peace talks. But if you actually open the text, there are several things that completely destroy its credibility or its potential to be an actual call for peace. Well, number one, it was public during the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, and the timing was chosen in order to attract maximum of media attention to the cause, right? It was published in two languages. It was published in Ukrainian and in English. And it was not published in Russian, even though Zelensky himself speaks Russian perfectly well, and it's the language that could have been more appropriate for this communication. But you could not find a Russian version of the text unless you had it translated. I mean, in the public space as well. So it was not addressed to the Russian-speaking audience, to the Russian people, and to the Russian president. I did look through the text in Ukrainian immediately after it was released. And well, I would say that 80% of the text is quite insulting. So he goes into his interpretation of events, and he goes into bringing up some of the facts that the war is causing over the Russian Federation, and there were quite a lot of things mentioned in that text that are definitely meaning that the actual reason for writing this letter was just to have grounds to say that he claimed something. But it definitely wasn't serious in terms of, I mean, you don't address a person with insults if you want to have a constructive conversation. So it was definitely not addressed neither to the Russian president nor to the Russian-speaking audience. I would like to remind you that it was done right after drone strikes were targeting St. Petersburg during the economic forum that was attended by thousands of foreigners from all over the world. So it's also something that doesn't seem to be logical. First, you attack an economic forum that consists of not just Russian people, but also guests from all over the world. And then you say that you're coming up with a peace deal. So I think the comment that was made during the forum by President Putin covered some of those points. And what else is important is that the letter itself and this initiative did not really contain any constructive grounds for negotiations. So, I mean, the dead end that Russia and Ukraine find themselves in terms of negotiations is there just simply because the positions are way too different. And even in terms of a potential mediator, it's a really difficult task to pick a mediator, because you cannot have countries that are involved into the conflict as the ones supplying weapons, and moreover accepting military budgets for the upcoming 5, 6, 7 years that imply increase of production targeting the potential enemy named Russia. You cannot have this kind of people at the negotiation table as some kind of warrants of peace, or some kind of uninterested third parties that are focused on resolving the conflict rather than making money on the conflict. So this cannot really be taken seriously in my personal opinion, and the opinion of many experts who have been discussing the issue. And definitely it's not let's say a correct path to move forward, because the correct path would have been setting up working groups that would first work through the details of the potential agreement, and would make sure that the actual situation, the realistic, let's say, approach is applied in order to draft a new peace agreement. And after a series of discussions between the working groups, a document can be elaborated that could be looked at also in presence of representatives of the international community and other potential warrants. But definitely that's not the procedure that was implied there, and it's not the actual reason for this letter to be published.
I will stay with you one more time, Yulia. We are looking at, President Putin actually noted that these attacks on the oil infrastructure has somehow affected the economy, though saying it's actually under the control. We want to look at how countries, especially India and other countries, are relying on Russian energy, how these recent, direct attacks on oil tankers, and of course, how they are actually reshaping the economic partnership between these countries, particularly nations that rely heavily on Russian oil for their own economic activities, because apparently there seems to be some sort of delays in supply, among others.
Well, there has been quite a lot of damage caused by the drone attacks, and of course there are quite a lot of difficulties and complications caused by the sanctions. And there have been several episodes when oil tankers carrying Russian products were captured, or different kinds of ways of applying pressure to the traders, to the sailors, and to everyone were being observed, right? So, of course, the sanctions, and of course the difficulties that are being faced in those deals, and those difficulties are have something to do with pretty much everything from logistics to financial transactions, and of course many of those sale operations right now are taking place not even in the ports but somewhere in the middle of the ocean, and of course it does affect everyone. I mean, all of the participants of those supply chains, because for the customer, it means that the price is higher than expected, and even with the regulations that are implied by the sanctions that regulate the top price at which Russian oil can be sold, it still becomes not as economically beneficial as it used to be. Of course, those attacks that are ongoing on oil infrastructure and on gas stations and infrastructure in Crimea and in the region of Donbass and in many other regions of Russia, they do negatively affect the overall situation of in the country. And it's been more than 4 years that Russia is in that position of having to restructure its economy, a lot of aspects of its social life, a lot of regulations and many other things. Yet the resilience that the system is still demonstrating shows that there has been and there still is quite a lot of resource potential. Of course, some of the damages it would take time to restore them, and there have been some new restrictions applied to foreign trade of the Russian oil and gas products, meaning that the priority at the moment is this supply of the internal market. And this will be affecting customers all over the world. But the example you gave with India, for instance, India itself will not be affected as much as one might think, because for the most part, India is a reseller. So not all of the Russian oil that comes to India stays there for internal consumption. Yet there would be effects on the final customers, and of course the amount of oil being and oil products being sold would be reduced. Because in this situation, the clear priority and the clear conclusion is that the internal market has to be ensured with all the necessary products first, right? And definitely, just like the war in Iran and the closure of the Hormuz Stream, it is affecting the situation globally, and it's another good reason for many of those countries to rethink the geopolitical situation in the world in general, and come to the conclusions that a more sovereign model and more of cooperation in terms of development of own infrastructure and more of cooperation in terms of conflict settlement is definitely needed, because, well, for quite a long period of time, for many, it was a very profitable situation that Russian oil could be bought at cheaper prices due to all of those complications. Yet at the same time, at the moment, the situation is changing. The priorities have to change as well, and it would definitely have short-term and mid-term effects over the consumption. Yet the long-term effects that it has to have is that kind of conclusions in terms of revising some of the aspects of the economy, industry, and geopolitics.
Thank you so much, dear Yulia. And of course, actually what is imperative is how to reduce the collateral damage of the war. And this brings me to you, Caleb Mothin. We are looking at the war and recent escalation, and of course we know that in the preamble of the Russian Federation, they have always stakeholders, especially Maria Zakharova, the Sergei Lavrov, and others have always made it clear in their outings, according to what we see on the news and the excerpts we've listened to, discover that why Russia is not having a harsh stance towards the crisis is because it wants to limit the collateral damage of the war. But then let's come back to answer this. Do you think with this recent development, it can lead to a more severe or drastic decision from the Russian part that can then lead us to that part of, full escalation that can be characterized as some sort of war between Russia and NATO or the EU that can eventually spiral into other countries?
Well, I want to answer your question in kind of a roundabout way. I want to first point out that one interesting development that occurred this week was that Tulsi Gabbard, who is the U.S. Director of National Intelligence, uh, she's stepped down and appears that she's leaving office. Now, there's rumors about it being about her opposing the war in Iran, but it's not clear if that's what happened. But Tulsi Gabbard, as she was leaving, she released all kinds of information about the biolabs that the Ukrainian authorities have been developing in coordination with the U.S. Department of Defense and with other governments. And these facilities in which biological weapons and gain of function research were being developed, they were looking to develop germ warfare, basically, to use against Russians. They were seeking to acquire living genetic material from Russians in order to conduct these research. This research, they were, conducting experiments on human beings, trying to infect them with diseases. This was a very, very awful thing, and Russia raised the alarm starting in 2017 about these dangerous biolabs. Then in 2023, when the special military operation began, Russia revealed all kinds of information it had acquired from these facilities. And U.S. leaders said it was a crazy conspiracy theory. They laughed it off. They said these biolabs don't exist. Oh, this is just a crazy Russian propaganda. Well, now we have actual documents from the U.S. Director of National Intelligence, all kinds of American government files showing that Russia told the absolute truth. These biolabs did exist, and evil things were being done. They were plotting to carry out germ warfare and germ attacks against Russia, and the details about what they were doing is just so shocking. And it's really good that this information is now available. And it would be great if the officials in the U.S. government who lied about this and laughed off what Russia was raising the concern about American government cooperation with Ukraine, these 40 different biolabs that existed, it would be nice if they would apologize for lying, but I don't think they will. I wanted to mention that in light of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, and also in light of Chinese President Xi Jinping's recent visit to Pyongyang, the Wall Street Journal, which is a mainstream media publication in the United States, owned by News Corporation, the same corporation that owns Fox News, Rupert Murdoch, they decided to do an article highlighting the economic achievements of North Korea. The headline was about North Korea is a surprising economic success. That article was not an accident. That article served a diplomatic purpose. When the Wall Street Journal runs an article saying that your economy is doing really well, they're essentially, doing you a favor. And it's important to point out that that's probably related to the hope around the Bering Sea Bridge and many other things. Now, my organization, the Center for Political Innovation, we've been going to the college campuses throughout America with this booklet, and it's called "Why Is It Impossible to Get This Flower in America?" We walk up to college students and say, "Have you heard about this flower? It's impossible to get in America." And a lot of them are interested. And as they open it, they learn that this flower is called Kim Il Sungya. And it was created in 1965 in Indonesia as a symbol of friendship between the people of the Korean Peninsula and the people of Indonesia shortly before the brutal U.S.-backed coup that toppled the Indonesian government. And the pamphlet gives a basic introduction to the anti-imperialist, anti-globalist worldview, the pro-growth, multipolarity worldview. And it uses Kim Il Sungya, the flower, as a way of telling this story. And we've gotten thousands of this pamphlet out to college students across America. And one thing I want to highlight is in this pamphlet, we have an image of the Monument of African Renaissance. This is a beautiful, beautiful monument that was constructed by North Korea in Senegal to commemorate Senegal's independence. And it shows an African family, an African father, an African mother, and their child pointing toward the sky, pointing toward the future. It's just an example of the optimism that the rising new BRICS economy presents to the world. And we've been doing outreach with this pamphlet, trying to bring this awareness. And you raised the question. Now I'll get to why I'm giving a roundabout answer to your question. The reason that all of this is important, and the reason that I really hope our leaders are not foolish enough to have a direct confrontation with Russia, is because if the EU countries and if the NATO countries and if the United States were to go direct into confrontation with Russia, Russia would destroy us. Russia would devastate us, because the American youth right now, they're not ready to fight a war. They don't know who they are. They don't know what to believe in. They talk about how ideology is like when you're driving a car, right? When you're driving down the road, you know where you're going, you know where you came from, you know how you're getting there, so you drive down the road. Well, imagine that you're driving down the road and suddenly you don't know where you came from, and you don't know where you're going, and you don't know how you're getting there. You would stop the car. You would stop the car. Well, ideology is like that. Ideology gives you an understanding of where you came from, where you're going, how you're getting there, and it gives people purpose. And in the West, we have embraced the postmodern ideology of liberalism that says ideology must be deconstructed. And millions of our young people don't know who they are. They have no real purpose in life. And you look at the rate of suicide and drug addiction. You look at the mental health crisis going on. You look at just the lack of physical fitness. The idea that our 19 and 20-year-olds in America are going to put on a uniform and go face off with Russia in a war, it's just not realistic. Russia would devastate and destroy us because we are in a civilizational crisis here in the West, and it's a crisis that's much deeper than the economic crisis. It's a spiritual and ideological crisis, and it's spawned by liberalism, and it's spawned by the Western obsession with individualism and the breakdown of the ideologies that hold civilizations together. So I really hope our leaders are not foolish enough to engage in such a confrontation.
Indeed, thank you so much for that, Caleb. Just let you know, ladies and gentlemen, if you are just tuning in, this is Global Insight, your knowledge sharing platform. And of course, today we are still on the Ukraine crisis. It's been discourse all over the world, but then we continue to bring about these discussions to give us a wider picture of the effect of such a proxy war and how it affects the tenets of diplomacy, international relations, and even questions the philosophy of globalization. With you, Thierry, let's still look at this from what Yulia and the others highlighted, especially on this aspect of avoiding a full escalation. According to a German official, he said Europe could sleepwalk in court into conflict with Russia. And when we want to look at some of the analysis that have been presented, we will pattern that actually Joseph Borrell said that some years ago that the EU's involvement in Ukraine is not necessarily to support Ukraine, but it's for a wider, their own personal interest, and that's where the geopolitical stakes come in. So let's try to understand the philosophy of double standards in the EU war, and how, if this it's not carefully managed, can lead to some sort of full escalation with very with consequences at that moment.
First of all, I would like to bring some complement of information regarding the bioweapons that Caleb was underlining regarding the declaration of Tulsi Gabbard. Actually, this is my team in 2022 that has been developing a massive inquiry and investigation to discover what was going on in regard of those laboratories that have been developed all over Europe, and especially in Ukraine. The biggest one is in Georgia, and this is our journalist, Diana Gaidanjeva, that has been discovering that the DoD has been implementing a massive labs and developing, increasing the functionality of different viruses, extremely dangerous. And actually, I was the guy that has been writing to Senator Wenstrup and Tulsi Gabbard to underline what we have been discovering. And in the book that I have been writing, that you can find in Amazon, which is called Ukraine, a warning to the world, you will find all the details regarding those labs. And actually, it goes, in fact, even to the test of the COVID virus that has been set up in Odessa in the Meshnikov Institute. And I have been finding the record into the procurement database of the United States. And actually, I've been participating to this investigation with some former people from Pentagon, and who have been discovering all the record necessary, in fact, to prove it. So basically, this is a very old story, and I'm very surprised that it's just coming out in the media right now. So I'm going to close, in fact, this parenthesis, because I can speak about it during at least 1 hour. Now, to answer the question that you have been raising, I disagree somewhat with our Austrian friends, Jetta. I do believe that if a conflict is erupting, it wouldn't come from the Balkan, but from the Baltic region. And I am going to explain you the reason why I think this. Last summer, I was in Cambridge University, and I was participating to a forum, and I was in front of people of the CIA and several advisors of congressmen and senators from the United States. And they were explaining us that what they were trying to put together is a sort of belt of security constituted of a maximum of weapons and military soldiers within, in fact, those countries, in the way they will be containing an eventual invasions of Russia. But in regard of the budget that the European Union is assigning to Ukraine, and also the moves of different parts of armies from Germany, from England, and from France that are shifting to those countries, I can easily understand that they will be setting up provocations to attack Belarus in the way that Russia will be obliged, in fact, to interfere. So now let's go to another level in the way that we understand, in fact, what is the real reason of those systemic provocation that are set up. We have been seeing, for example, Starobelsk in Donbass, these schools that has been bombed and killed so many school children, which is a nonsense on a military point of view. We have been seeing, in fact, the St. Petersburg attack, which is, in my opinion, a major marketing mistake from Zelensky, because as 180 countries were participating to the forum, I can easily imagine, in fact, the reactions of the participants. It means that, in fact, those people would be perceiving this attack as a personal attack on their countries, in fact, to force them for quitting the forum when there is a big will, in fact, to participate. So basically, the effect expected is completely opposite to whatsoever is happening on the perception point of view. What we are looking at right now is a sort of internationalization of terrorism and piracy. We are hearing from Kaja Kallas that she is asking for seizing all the oil tankers of Russia in the Mediterranean. I can imagine, in fact, the reaction of the Russian if this is happening. They would be entitled in international water, in fact, to interfere on a military point of view. So basically, there is a sort of escalation of provocation between the European Union and Russia that can bring us, in fact, to the unthinkable. We are seeing Germany that is transforming completely its economy into a military economy. We are seeing, for example, the factory of Volkswagen that is not going to produce any more cars, but weapons. Where do they want to go like that? So basically, if we are looking at what is happening in Europe with this buildup of sanctions, this buildup of strong will to control the narrative of people within, in fact, the social network. The sanctions that are applied, in fact, to citizens of European Union. And I'm thinking about Xavier Moreau, who do not have, in fact, the right, in fact, to come back in its own country. He was supposed, in fact, to attend a major conference in Canada, and Macron has been giving orders in the way that he wouldn't be able, in fact, to participate to the conference. So basically, he arrived in Canada, and at the airport, the employees of the custom has been telling him he hasn't got the right, in fact, to penetrate in the territory. So basically, we're seeing, in fact, a number of people that are targeted by those sanctions, because when a state is very fragile, what it's trying to do is to control the narrative, to control the people, and to forbid the people, in fact, to tell the truth. You see? And now let's look at what is happening in France, because this is very serious. In about 1 month, Macron, for the 14th of July, which is a national celebration, is going to invite on the Champs-Élysées most of the army of the European Union. So basically, he's sending a very strong message to our populations that he wants to build a European army. He has been humiliated by Vladimir Putin in 2022, putting him at the extremity of a gigantic table. You remember this episode? And this guy, being transgressive, he wanted, in fact, to take his revenge, because on a political point of view, he sees himself exiting the Élysée by sitting at the heads of European Union as the first president. But to do so, he needs, in fact, to trigger a conflict in the way that he will be gathering the European population. He will be able, in fact, to justify the federalization of Europe. And for this, the only way that he has to do so is to provoke and to generate a massive conflict. But in regard of the fact that this guy is not mature, he don't understand the people that he has in front of him. I am dealing with Russian ministers, and I understand the way they think, because they are telling me how they see the things evolving. We are taking a massive risk, in fact, to provoke Russia at this level. But as Macron is a transgressive individual, and he don't care about the population, the only thing that is very important for him is its own person and his own career. So basically, on top of it, he has been inviting the Ukrainian army, in fact, to participate, in fact, to this event on the 14th, which is a gigantic insult to our history, to our hero, to our resistance of the Second World War. I'm thinking about Jean Moulin, who has been tortured by the Nazis. And don't forget one thing. When the Das Reich division is withdrawing from France, they are stopping into a village that is called Oradour-sur-Glane. But this Das Reich division is constituted of essentially Ukrainian, and the entire village has been decimated and massacred. So basically, Macron is inviting people that has a very murky past, because they are completely linked to the Shoah, due to the fact that the nationalists of UPA has been participating to the killing of 1.4 million people in Ukraine, Jewish, Russian, Tsigan, and so on. So basically, Macron, in his way of thinking, is pushing to the limit. And now, the people in France, they start, in fact, to realize what is happening. They don't want to see the Ukrainian on the Champs-Élysées. Okay. And this, I think it's going to turn turn into a real scandal. And one of the deputies I've been meeting this week have been asking me to participate to a hearing within our parliament in the Foreign Affairs Commission. If this is happening, I am going to trigger the biggest scandal of our history.
And it shows, of course, what you've said, the complexity of war, and of course how interest and politics will always be at a point of dilemma. And that is to an extent, from what has been said so far, will give us reasons why diplomacy has been failing. Now that diplomacy has failed or seemingly failed, and others still actually believe that diplomacy can solve the crisis, where Russia is actually invited on the negotiation table, and not Europe against Russia. And when talking about this the Ukraine crisis, and then we are looking at the hybrid nature of it and all the stakes involved, it brings us to how other countries will interpret proxy wars, or wars that have some sort of international ramifications, and how it affects international relations. With you, Dr. Ashil Eke, we want to try to compare to an extent how this is affecting the diplomatic geopolitical calendar, the diplomatic calendar, and even the political calendar, among others, of the African continent, in some sort of the fight for independence or total sovereignty, with the core, the people-centric agenda as the reason for such revolutions.
Well, I think this war is showing to African that they have to rely on them and only on them, because we know this since this Iran war, this Ukraine war started, there's a lot of issues in terms of food, instead of things like food, oil, and so many different issues, cereals, that many countries are depending on, and those products were coming from Ukraine, and also since the war started, we've seen a lot of countries that have been depending on those cereals, not having them, and even remember the president of Senegal even going to Russia to beg for cereals, to be, sent to different countries that are really short on provisions. So it's important that we continue to march towards our independence, economic independence, and self-sustainability. Because if we don't do that, then we are at the mercy of any war. And with the current situation in the world economically, with Iran war happening, we have war with Hezbollah, hot war with the Palestinians, and then the Ukraine that is most likely going to expand in some shape or form, because I see the European leaders are eager to get into this war to justify their failures to their population, the economic failure, the political failure to their population, because that's the only way out. And they look at Ukraine as the only way for them to salvage their regimes. So it's Africa is always on the receiving end of all these bad decisions, and so it's time for us to work towards free economic or self-sustainability in terms of food and all the other resources that we need, that we all have in the continent. The interesting part is we have all those resources in our continent. We just don't know how to use them, how to use them to our advantage. And when we see, for example, the Dangote refinery that is in Nigeria. We see the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and all these organizations pounding on that refinery, trying to shut it down, trying to revert, prevent them from getting the resource. The oil that they need in order for it to refine, for the refinery to be able to operate at optimal capacity and even extend. Because I think Dangote wants to expand his refinery from 600,000 barrels a day to about 1.2 million, something like that. that you can refine. So they don't want us to do that, but we have to fight. They're not going to let us. They're not going to let us, get our economic independence easily. We have to fight for it, and the best way to do that is to coalesce, to work together, and then push back hard, and our political leaders have to also join the fight, as well as the populations. That's the only way we're going to push back on these international organizations that are trying to keep us dependent on raw materials and their aid, their foreign aid. So that's the way I see it, and I believe with many companies like Dangote and other in other countries, that will allow Africa to be able to start building its own solutions, its own internal solutions to its own economic issues, without counting so much on international aid.
Absolutely. While giving importance to international relations, it is always very imperative to have a very strong internal backing or trajectory that will actually compete with the complexities or challenges of the global trends. Ladies and gentlemen, we continue with the conversation with Dr. Dieter. Here we are looking at some sort of controversies within Europe because, according to information, Ukrainian drones have been actually have landed many countries in the Europe, actually bringing out questions as to how this can be prevented to ensure that the target, the Russian target, doesn't actually hit instead neighboring countries or countries in the EU supporting Ukraine in its defense and security, especially the Baltic states. With you, Dr. Data, how can we define the European path at this particular juncture, and how practical or pragmatic their decision, or maybe diplomatic decisions in line with the Ukraine war?
Well, first of all, let me briefly, say in response to my previous speaker Thierry, I meant the Baltic region, not the Balkans, of course. If I said the Balkans, sorry, that was a slip. I meant, of course, the Baltic region, where I see the most dangerous developments. But it brings me to your question. I mean, what we see actually, particularly not only since February 22, but even before, is that the European side, Brussels, are playing a very, very destructive role on the diplomatic arena. They are actually pouring oil into the fire, and sometimes we need to wonder why they're doing it in that way. They're doing it because they will not be able to deal with the consequences, as other speakers before said. I mean, what we're seeing is Europe is harshly pushing towards an armed confrontation with Russia, and Europe is. I don't think that Europe is. Really sees the consequences, the European leaders. And we've heard before the talks regarding the push for a European army. What is way more concerning also is the increasing talks about building a European nuclear bomb, an atomic bomb, to build a common European nuclear arsenal. And that we are actually in an era where these things are openly discussed. Again, shows in which really, really worrying, dangerous situation we are right now. we see regular attacks on peaceful nuclear facilities in Iran, in the UAE, in Ukraine. The aggressors, US, Israel, the Ukrainian side, are not condemned by the International Atomic Energy Agency. So it's actually it's attacks on nuclear facilities have become the new normal in international warfare, and Europe, instead of trying to mitigate this threat, they are bringing in one anti-Russian, one anti-Iranian resolution after another at the IAEA to further continue the spiral of confrontation, and they start talking about developing a European nuclear arsenal. I mean, on the other side, who with this talk, they are threatening the Russian side, one of the major nuclear powers, and I think there's only one small positive signs we see in this whole recent developments is that some of the loudest voices arguing for an armed confrontation with Russia have become silent since the US got a really hard slap, so to say, in their aggression against Iran, where it became clear and visible for everyone that the transatlantic military dominance is fading. This has been clearly witnessed not only by Russia, but particularly by China. The loudest talks in Brussels have become silent in recent weeks. Still, the continuation and the military buildup against Russia continues, but the statements became less and less confrontational. Now we even hear talks about replacing Kaya Kallas, who was one of those figures who were particularly pushing towards confrontation with Russia. So I think among certain circles in the EU, there was a certain rethinking also when we witnessed the Iranian response to the military aggression in West Asia in recent weeks. And I mean, in the next couple of hours, we see most likely the signing of an agreement between the US and Iran. And that agreement basically includes everything that the Iranian side actually wanted. And this is witnessed in Brussels, of course. And the same fate we will see if really EU is continuing their provocations, their confrontations in the Baltic regions, looking for a pretext for a direct armed confrontation between NATO and Russia. And this will have very severe consequences for Europe, for the European economy. Now it's already now that Europe is a major the European economy has suffered a major blow due to the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, but also due to the self-inflicted negative consequences with the sanctions against Russia that Europe cut off their oil and gas resources themselves. And at the same time, what is also very, very dangerous development that we see in the EU is what we shall not forget, this undermining of freedom of expression, of freedom of speech. Everyone who tries to come up with a more objective and neutral and balanced analysis of the tensions with Russia is put on the European sanctions list. Most recently, Jacques Beau the German journalist Doku, just because they are not repeating the standard Brussels narrative regarding the war in Eastern Europe. And this is a very, very dangerous development that completely undermines the cohesion of the European society. And we're moving into a more and more undemocratic situation that I guess we no one of us would have ever imagined 10 years ago, that such a situation is developing in Western, in Central Europe.
I will stay with you, Dr. Jeter. You just highlighted some of the some military red lines in line with the NATO alliance. It means to an extent, diplomacy, strategic diplomacy is still very important if they actually want to bring forth a lasting solution to the Ukraine crisis. So, in your own perspective, given the limitations of the military strength of EU countries and their over reliance on the United States, we also acknowledge the fact that French President Macron has been advocating for Europe to be very independent in its own defense sphere. But then the issue at stake, what viable or reliable diplomatic measures do you think at this juncture EU countries, NATO can take to be able to come to a point of discussion with the Russian Federation regarding the stakes of the Ukraine crisis?
Well, Brussels, the EU needs to come to such a situation, and actually, for the benefits of themselves, they need to find once again a common ground. First of all, among the EU member states, and then a willingness to reach out to Russia, because what we're seeing here is at the moment is that the European Union has put itself into a corner. They were cheerleading an armed confrontation in Ukraine since long before 2014. Then with the coup in Maidan, it was all accelerated. But they thought they have the backing of a strong NATO led by the United States. But this is gone. And at the same time, Russia is clearly building their own organizations, their own ideas for a Eurasian security architecture, with their annual conferences discussing Eurasian security in Minsk every year in October, November. These conferences are being held. Closer relationships are built in this context with Central Asian states, of course, with China, with the Gulf states, with India. So we're seeing an emergence of parallel organizations to the existing international organizations, in parallel to the OSCE, a new emerging Eurasian security architecture led by Russia. So in this whole changing geopolitical dynamics, the decrease of the transatlantic hegemony and the rise of multipolarity, the biggest loser is actually not the United States, it's Europe, because Europe have, as I said before, put themselves into a corner, and it will be very, very difficult to get out of it and not be left behind, because that's how it looks at the moment. Look at all the major rounds of negotiations. In February, for instance, we had parallel negotiations in Geneva. I was in Geneva during these days reporting from these negotiations. The US side with Iran, mediated by Oman, at the same time, Witkoff, Kushner, and the U.S. delegation held talks in Geneva regarding Ukraine. But at none of these negotiations, Europe had a place on the table. So Europe needs to find the courage to reach out to Russia and re-establish diplomatic links. But as it looks at the moment, they're unwilling to do so. There are small steps and small deeds by Europe, even by supposedly neutral countries like Austria, show that they are not willing to do that. For instance, the deputy envoy or who was supposed to be the incoming deputy envoy of Russia to the international organizations in Vienna has been rejected. He won't get accreditation from Austria. This is a diplomatic affront to Russia once again. So even behind the scenes, Europe clearly shows they are not willing to speak with Russia. They're not willing to reestablish a normal diplomatic relationship with Russia. But at the end of the day, this is only harming Brussels itself.
Thank you so much for that. And in the same perspective, we continue to look at how differing interests and agenda will always actually either sustain a war or probably put an end to the war. With you, Caleb Muffin, we want to somehow still in line with how the trajectory or the course of the Ukraine war, particularly at the front line and even at the level of taking strategic decisions, be it on the part of the Russian Federation or the European Union or the Kiev regime backed by the EU and NATO. Let's look at the aspect of sovereignty versus security sphere, and then while talking earlier, Dr. Deta highlighted the aspect of neutrality, but then we've all listened to the preamble, to the analysis that you have presented, and we discovered that it's a complex web for sure, built with resistance, of course, power and fame. Do we talk about neutrality or objectivity of narratives with such a probably in such a complicated or complex situation like what we are seeing in the case of the Ukraine crisis, with many stakeholders with different agenda, though with one battlefield and one enemy for sure?
Well, at the end of the day, the objection of Wall Street and London to Russia is that it exists. It's not about a policy that Russia has carried out. It's not about statements made by the Russian leaders. It's about the fact that Russia exists as an economic force. They don't want competitors. When Russia was down for the count and bleeding out during the 1990s, that's when Bill Clinton loved Boris Yeltsin. Oh, they loved Russia because Russia was devastated by the fall of the Soviet Union. But when Putin restored Russia's economy with putting oil and gas under public ownership, creating mega state-controlled corporations, Gazprom and Rosneft, using that energy revenue to restore Russia's industrial base, once Russia was a competitor, suddenly they hated Russia once again, just like they did during the Soviet years. And that's an important thing to understand, is that that Wall Street and London want to maintain a monopoly. They want the world as their captive markets. You can talk about this from different angles. We're coming up on the anniversary of the American Revolution. July 4th will be the 250-year anniversary of our country here in America. And our country was established because the British Empire didn't want America as a competitor. They wanted America to just be a temporary holdout, a trading hub in their sea-based global empire. And the founders of America, for a lot of different reasons, with a lot of different agendas, some of them were slaveholders, a lot of them wanted westward expansion and to take land from Native Americans. But what they really agreed on was they wanted America to have its own economy. And the British didn't want that. And we had a revolution. And the American School of Economics, that, Alexander Hamilton, one of the founders of the United States, who opposed slavery and was a big supporter of the Haitian Revolution, the slave revolution in Haiti. Alexander Hamilton constructed a national bank, and the idea was we were going to have a strong, prosperous economy. And his economic theories were continued by Henry Charles Carey, the economic advisor to Abraham Lincoln, who contrasted the English system of global sea-based empires concentrating wealth in the hands of a mighty city. He talked about India underworking the Hindu and sinking the rest of the world down to his level, versus what he envisioned as the American system, a system that invested in an economy on the land, invested in maintaining a strong economy with building infrastructure and a national bank. So he talked about the English system of the British Empire versus the American system. But we also have Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Lenin, the founder of the Soviet Union, he wrote a very important book explaining the foundation of World War I called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, where he explained that capitalism in the 1890s moved toward its monopolistic stage of big banks, and banks having dominance over industry, and banks engaging in territorial partition, seizing chunks of the world as captive markets, the export of capital, the rise of an international financial oligarchy. He called this system, he called it imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. And he echoed what had been said by Rosa Luxemburg when she talked about capital accumulation and her very important pamphlet, the Junius pamphlet. And nowadays, in Eurasia and in Russia and in China, there's an interest in geopolitics, and there's talk of Atlanticism and the British Empire system continuing the Roman Empire model, which is now continued by Wall Street and the United States, the Atlanticist, ocean-based empire model of having a mighty navy and controlling trade routes, versus Eurasianism, which is the form of civilization on the land. You can do all kinds of different analysis, but when it gets down to it, the reality is that when the empires of the sea and their mighty navies seize hold and besiege the civilizations of the land, from the soil, emerges forces that assert the people's will to resist and the people's will to have economic development and build themselves up. And we see that with the rise of Russian President Vladimir Putin. We see that with the rise of the Communist Party of China, Xi Jinping and Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping before them. We see that now on the African continent with the Union of Sahel States and Ibrahim Traore. And that when the peoples of the land are besieged by the empires and the raiders of the sea, from the soil emerge forces that will assert humanity's basic will to live and grow and thrive against the Malthusian forces of destruction. And this is almost a natural process. And you can frame it in terms of geopolitics. You can frame it in terms of economic theories. You can frame it in terms of geopolitics. You can frame it in spiritual and religious terms. This is the reality of what's taking place. And Russia and China, they sit at the center of a global block of resistance to the empires of the sea, globalism, imperialism. And as a patriot, as someone who loves America, I realize that the only future America has is breaking out of the sea-based empire. We, the Americans, are a people of the land, and we can be a people of the land. And our revolution in 1776 was about striving to be a civilization of the land and rejecting the empire of the sea. And I would argue that in the process of the decay that we are facing and the drive toward war and a low-wage police state, the American people will have to mobilize and build a movement to demand a civilization of the land and a growth-based economy and friendship and multipolarity with the people of the world.
Also good to define how the future will look like, and how the present contestations or provocations can affect the international relations calendar, and especially in the world of multi-polarity. Coming back to you, Thierry Laurent, when we listen to all the analysis that have been brought forth by the experts, and we want to ask some of the questions, understanding again how international war affects the interactions between countries. Here we are looking at let's go back memory lane to highlight the James Monroe Doctrine that in simple terms actually prevented Europe from colonization, and especially from places where the United States has some sort of a sphere of influence. And then if we want to relate it to the Ukraine crisis and some of the key points that have been highlighted by the Russian Federation, where especially the president, when he spoke to Tucker Carlson, Russia is not fighting Ukraine. Russia is actually fighting a geopolitical war, citing NATO and the EU. But at this juncture, we're seeing Europe respecting the Monroe Doctrine. But then when it comes to the Ukraine crisis and the position of the Russian Federation, there are terminologies like invasion of Ukraine and violation of the rights of a sovereign state. How can we understand all of these, and of course contextualizing it with the crisis and looking at the way forward towards peace and avoiding escalation or provocation that can lead to a third world war in the world?
Well, I don't think that Russia is attacking the sovereignty of Ukraine. The problem is completely different. We have a minority, which is Ukrainian, because if you look at the demographic of Ukraine, you will understand that this geopolitical puzzle has been constituted over time by the will of the Bolshevik, and the Ukrainian entity within this country itself was in a minority. And that was the reason why there was so much friction on the political point of view. If you look at the Russian population in Ukraine and the Russophone in Ukraine, we talk about 42 to 46% of the population. So basically, when the coup of Maidan has been developing, and those who has been taking over power decided, in fact, for eliminating a part of the population, that is the reason why Vladimir Putin decided, in fact, to interfere. It was not a question of territories, despite the fact that if you look at the history of Ukraine, you will understand that the Donbass used to be Russian, and the Malorussia, meaning in fact the south of Ukraine, used to be owned by Russia. Proof of it, Yekaterina II of Russia was asking for the nephew of Cardinal of Richelieu to build the city of Odessa, and therefore that was a Russian city. And she was saying, Odessa and Crimea will always be Russian in the future, as in the past, as in the present. Okay, so basically, what Vladimir Putin has been doing is protecting the population of being decimated by people that wanted, in fact, to get rid of them. Now, of course, the West has been leveraging these differences, in fact, to make sure that they will be destabilizing the power of Vladimir Putin, because they were envisioning also the seizure of all the resources that Russia is sitting on. So basically, if we are taking some distance out of the situation, we are saying that the West want to maintain its way of handling a relationship through a form of neo-colonialism. When the world has been moving away from this approach and wants, in fact, to handle international relationship on a more balanced manner. This is where, in fact, the multilaterality is coming from. Now, what we're observing here is a sort of confrontation of social model. We have Russia representing, in fact, the history and the culture, the religion, and we have this new class of politicians that are considering that borders should not exist. They should, in fact, establish a one world government, because their ultimate goal, which is like the ultimate capitalism, is about to put the control on all the populations in an Orwellian style, to establish a sort of class of, how to say, small kings that would have all the privilege against a population that needs to serve them. So basically, it's worse than ultimate capitalism. This is a sort of feudalism. Okay. So basically, if we are looking at the doctrine of Trump, he is against, in fact, this globalization of power. And he wants, in fact, to recentrate the capacity of United States to what we call the doctrine of Monroe in a Donald Trump fashion, which they call this the Don Roe or something like that. So if we are looking at the way that he's acting, he wants, in fact, to secure the energetic resources, and that is the reason why he has been invading Venezuela. He wanted, in fact, to take over the resources in Iran and destroy, in fact, the capacity of production of all the Gulf countries, because he wants to sit on the control of the energetic supply in the world. But his plan has been completely collapsing. Nevertheless, what makes me feeling a little comfortable in regard of the incapacity of Europe, in fact, to conduct a massive attack on Russia is the fact that United States is withdrawing its resources little by little from Europe, which would make, in fact, the European uncomfortable due to the fact that they wouldn't have the infrastructure that United States is providing to support an eventual conflict. But on the other side, don't forget one thing: the European Union is completely broke. And what they are trying to achieve here is the total destruction of the economy in the way that they can install their famous CBDC, meaning the central bank digital currency, which is the backbone of the full control of the population. But as there is a major problem of energy supply, I do believe that the plan to conduct a massive attack on Russia might be collapsing, because, in fact, all the necessary resources are not on the table. Nevertheless, I do believe that the next 3 to 6 months are going to be critical, because if Donald Trump is getting kicked out due to his mismanagement of the situation in Iran, and the fact that we might be facing a major economical crisis, because if we are looking at all the indexes representing the economy, we can understand that, in fact, the consumer in the United States are not very happy and are at a major risk. Therefore, he will be losing, in fact, the middle term election, and then the Dems will be taking over, pushing the European, in fact, to conduct this attack. So basically, we will see what is going on. And I do believe that the next 6 months are going to be the most dangerous moment of the humanity.
Absolutely very important, and we are coming, ladies and gentlemen, to the last phase of the discussion. Of course, proposals, recommendations, how the stakeholders involved in the war can actually proceed from here, and of course how the world, especially in line with public diplomacy or people-to-people diplomacy, can interpret the crisis that is happening. Of course, call it the proxy war, to better give meaning to some sort of people-centric diplomacy that will also give importance to globalization and international relations and interactions. So I start off with you, Dr. Dieter. Now, according to news, we see that some opinions have actually talking about an escalation or a full-blown war by 2030 regarding the preparedness from the Russian side. This was actually highlighted by some officials in the EU, saying Russia is working towards having a direct attack on NATO, and therefore calling on the European countries to actually prepare. And according to what they said, they are not preparing to fight Russia, but rather to actually deter when Russia invades. And here, some pundits still see the EU as in the aspect of belligerence. And of course, let's try to understand this. Do we really see this escalation in 2030, like a full-blown war between Russia against NATO? Or so can maybe the next 6 months change the course of the war?
Well, hopefully, it will, because as Thierry said before, like the next 6 months are crucial. Uh, at the moment, both sides are preparing for a full-scale escalation by 2030. The European side openly says that, of course, they are trying to sell their narrative as deterrence, as defense mechanisms. But in fact, if you look at the history of the whole region and the whole Eurasian continent since 1991, we clearly see that there's only one aggressor, and this one aggressor is NATO, because NATO has expanded. NATO has expanded step by step towards towards the Russian border. First, it expanded towards the east, the western border of Russia, with the final, so to say, planned jigsaw puzzle, taking over Ukraine. It failed, although there is a NATO puppet regime in place in Kiev. It failed to get Ukraine as a full member into NATO, but at the same time, first they went eastwards towards the Russian border, and then starting to encircle Russia. Let's not forget the close cooperation with the US, Australia, and so on in the Pacific region. The opening of a NATO liaison bureau in Japan. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, as it's called. What is it doing in Japan, in the Pacific, and so on? But it's encircling. It's an attempt to encircle Russia. Maybe also an attempt to provide assistance for the US in their preparations regarding an armed confrontation, military confrontation with China in this Pacific region. So this is a very dangerous situation. Of course, the Russian side is observing that clearly they are preparing for such a situation now as well, and we can only really hope that actually there is back a return of some sense of reason within Brussels to stop this really dangerous stumbling into a full-blown escalation with unimaginable and uncontrollable consequences, not only for Europe or Eastern Europe or Eurasia, for the whole humanity.
So much, Dr. Tete. To you, Caleb Mofin. Of course, we are looking at the people affected largely by the crisis and how civilians can be protected, because full escalation will mean that there has been compromise in terms of collateral damage. So in your own perspective, what do you think are those strategic decisions that can be taken, particularly from the Russian side, with these recent provocations and of an escalations to, bring about some measures that will not have some sort of dire consequences on human population. Remember that the special military operation has as objective to protect the lives of civilians, Russians in the Donbass.
Well, as far as what Russia needs to do, I think Russia, as a sovereign country, has the right to determine how they want to defend themselves and how they want to wage a war of self-defense. And I, as an American, don't feel a need to comment on how they choose to do it. This is their right as a sovereign country. I will say that if there were to be a direct confrontation between the NATO countries and Russia, that would likely lead to a nuclear war and the end of humanity, and that everything must be done to avoid it. I think Ukraine is becoming more vicious because they're losing the war, and that's why they're striking out and becoming vicious, because they know they're on the way to lose. I mean, it's going to be over soon, and they are trying to inflict as much damage and create as much of a pain and suffering for the Russian people in the process of losing the conflict. I want to say that at the end of the day, what we need urgently in America, my country, is a mass movement. We need a movement based on principles of anti-imperialism, based on principles of solidarity and love for humanity. We need a movement. Podcasts are not enough. We need people to bring themselves together into organized resistance communities. And that's what my organization, the Center for Political Innovation, has been striving to do. We have gatherings all over the country. We do mass outreach. We do education. We're trying to build a movement, because a movement is what this country urgently needs. The American people know these wars are being waged for a group of billionaire bankers that are not loyal to this country and don't care about this country. The American people know our freedoms are being taken away. The American people know our civil liberties are being stripped away, and we're losing the freedom that this country boasts about around the world. But the answer is a mass movement, and only a mass movement can save America and bring America into the rising new world.
Indeed, it's about giving importance to humanity by, of course, bringing policies that are human centric. And rounding off with you briefly, Terry Laurent, we quite remember that when these, direct attacks came right to Moscow, St. Petersburg, there were quite statements that came from Russian officials. And I will quote this, like the next blow will be more painful. Russian experts are signaling something bigger than retaliation. This was on the somehow around the 26th of May 2026. So we want to look at this proposed solution of managed escalation as a strategy of the Russian Federation in order to reduce some sort of the collateral damage of the crisis, particularly on its citizens.
Well, since the beginning of the end of this conflict, because in 2022, it was not the beginning of the country, it was the beginning of the ends of the country. President Vladimir Putin has been giving directions and asking for making sure that there will be a minimum of casualties on the civilian side. And that is the reason why he has been avoiding, in fact, to perpetrate what we call the carpet bombing that was used by the United States during the Second World War, which has been generating a maximum of casualties on the French population. But due to the fact that now, and Caleb was underlining it, Ukraine is losing this conflict. And we see on the front line that the Russian army is progressing every day, taking more and more territories. Example, what is happening now in Kramatorsk, that is a very big city, and the Russian army that is about 15 kilometers from it. We are seeing also Konstantinovka that is falling apart because the Russian army has been taking over about 90% of the city. So basically the front line is just collapsing little by little. But what Ukraine pushed by the UK MI6 services, they are continuing and increasing, in fact, the footprint of their terrorist attack. We remember what has been happening in Crocus, and then there was Starobelsk, and then they are hitting on the petroleum infrastructure, like in Kostruga, and so on. So basically, this is damaging, in fact, seriously the economy. And what is in the back end of the story is that Ukraine think that at a point in time, the population is going to retaliate against, in fact, their government, which is a major mistake, because the more you hit on them, the more, in fact, you are gathering people. Nevertheless, in the use in Russia, the problem is about the perception of the power, because they have difficulties, in fact, to travel and to enjoy, in fact, their freedom. So that might be an internal political problem. But at the end of the story, what we know is that Ukraine is going to collapse, and we start, in fact, to measure it. If you look at what is happening in Odessa, for example, we have, in fact, the TCC, which is an organization that is supposed, in fact, to kidnap the people in the men in the street to send them to the front line. They are getting beaten to the bone by the population because they are sick and tired of it. On top of it, there is so much corruption that even the soldiers that are on the front line, they are just realizing that they are cannon fodders, and that in the back end, the management is filling their pocket at a point that this is becoming an outrage. So basically, what I am suspecting is that the Ukrainian population is going to retaliate, and we are going to witness a sort of Maidan #3 that is going to be like a sort of political cleansing of the corruption for goods. And this is something that we need, in fact, to wish, because that might be the only way, in fact, to solve this conflict. Zelensky do not want, in fact, to sign any kind of agreement for several reasons. The first agreement, first of all, this is because he has no credibility and no legitimacy. He was not elected for the last 2 years. And on top of it, he knows pertinently that if he's signing an agreement, the extremist neo-Nazi like Pravi Sector, Carpathian Sich, or Azov will walk on Kiev and eliminate him. So basically, he's maintaining this sort of status quo with the European Union and the perception of the international community to continue the conflict, to continue to fill his pocket, and to make sure that he will be exiting this conflict with the help of the European Union. At the moment, in fact, he will push a provocation, in fact, to bring Nato inside of Ukraine. If we are relating to what the declaration of Macron, Stammer, and Merz, they were saying that they need to handle the security of Ukraine by putting the troop of NATO inside the Ukrainian territory, which is something that Vladimir Putin, since the beginning, are saying this is a red line, and if this is happening, that will be the ultimate provocation that would certainly trigger a massive conflict. So basically, yes, sorry.
Okay, please round off. We are already against time.
Okay, so basically, my perception is that either the European economy is collapsing and the population in Europe are just telling their government, now you stop and you get out because you don't want this conflict to occur, or also the government would be able, in fact, to conduct, in fact, their ultimate geopolitical goals, and this would be terminating into a nuclear conflict.
Okay, thank you so much, Terry, Laurent. Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of today's discursive program, Global Insight. We want to take this opportunity to say thank you to the panel of experts for the greater insight. Of course, it brings us again to another juncture where we will have to watch global trends to actually look at the cause of the crisis and how it is affecting international relations in the context of multilateralism. Just to note that critics are, of course, warning of some sort of direct confrontation if the attacks, the Kyiv EU, backed by EU and NATO attacks persist against Russia. And of course, supporters still see diplomacy and some sort of coordinated approach as a way to solving this problem. But then who are those to sit on the table for negotiations with interest and power and firm of particularly the collective West that seems to overwhelm the human-centric objective of the crisis or the special military operations. And it is on this note, ladies and gentlemen, that we draw the curtains into today's edition of the program while wishing you a blissful weekend in the company of transmissions on the Pan-African television. Bye-bye.
This program was brought to you by Globus.